was the last day of school before summer break. I, a 17-year-old girl, was counting the hours until the day was over. That morning, the school halls were filled with chaotic joy, students exchanging signatures in yearbooks and planning farewell parties. The atmosphere felt so lively, so full of energy, but little did we know that, by the afternoon, the entire school would descend into a nightmare. The school I attend is near a dense, mysterious, and immense forest that the administration has always forbidden us from entering. Some friends and I were planning a bold adventure to sneak into the forest after the final bell, just to prove there was nothing scary about it. But as the morning went on, something strange began to happen. The air grew heavy, the halls seemed quieter than usual, and a suffocating sense of unease settled over me. During the last class of the day, the doors to our classrooms suddenly locked themselves, as if sealed shut by some invisible force. At first, we thought it was a prank, but the atmosphere quickly shifted. A girl in the corner of the room began crying, and our teacher tried to calm her down, though he himself looked terrified. That's when we heard the first scream. Not just a normal scream, but one filled with agony, echoing through the halls. I stood up to look out the window, but before I could see anything, the teacher blocked my view, his face pale with panic. "You don't want to see this," he said. But whatever he was trying to hide couldn't be ignored for long. A few minutes later, another scream rang out, followed by the horrible sound of something heavy crashing to the ground. Against all warnings, I forced my way to the window, and what I saw froze the blood in my veins. In the hallway, there was a creature moving on all fours with impossible speed. Its body was covered in blood. The tattered white dress it wore was stained and ripped, and its long, disheveled black hair partially covered its face. But what truly terrified me was the moment it turned its head backward, revealing empty, soulless eyes and a mouth that seemed made only for destruction. It was chasing an 8th grade girl I recognized from my gym class, who was running desperately through the hallway, screaming for help. But before she could reach the exit, the creature caught her and began devouring her slowly, savoring every piece. My classmates started crying and panicking, but my friend next to me only whispered, "She can sense our fear. We're next." I tried to stay calm, but despair was written all over everyone's faces. That's when we heard loud knocks on the door, 3 heavy bangs, followed by an eerie, dead silence. The girl who had been crying earlier suddenly stood up, as if hypnotized, and whispered, "She's here." The air in the room grew dense, almost impossible to breathe, and a sickening stench of rotting flesh filled the space. The teacher tried to keep us calm, but even he looked like he was on the verge of breaking down. When the open window slammed shut with a loud bang, as if an invisible force had sealed it, I knew we were trapped. That's when the creature entered. The door creaked open slowly, and the room's deathly silence was shattered by the sound of its footsteps, mixed with the wet, squelching noise of something dripping. Its stench was unbearable, and its presence was suffocating. It stopped in the center of the room and turned its head toward 2 students sitting in the back. They didn't even have time to scream before it lunged, moving in a way that seemed impossible for any living being. I grabbed my friend's hand, and we ran out of the classroom while the creature was distracted devouring the couple. The hallway was even more horrifying. Bodies were scattered everywhere, some still twitching in their final moments. The walls were stained with blood, and screams echoed faintly in the distance. My friend stood frozen in shock, letting out a scream, a fatal mistake. The creature heard her and, with unnatural speed, darted into the hallway and grabbed her. All I could do was watch as my friend was lifted into the air and torn apart before my eyes. I was paralyzed with terror, tears streaming down my face. I knew I had to get away, but my legs felt like lead. I slowly crept back into the classroom, shutting the door silently behind me. I curled up in a corner, hugging my knees, trying to stifle my sobs. The classroom was almost empty now, except for me and a boy who sat in shock, trembling and murmuring incoherently. The teacher, still alive but visibly shaken, told us something that was both disturbing and shocking. This information I'm about to reveal might be the most crucial part of what's happening. He said this happens every 20 years. The creature comes from a forest, a curse left behind because the school was built on its sacred land. He explained that the creature was once human but was transformed by something unexplainable. There's no way to escape, he said, his voice hollow. Don't look into its eyes and it won't attack you, unless it's very hungry. I've been sitting in this classroom for hours, listening to the sounds of the creature chewing, the screams of those still alive, and the eerie silence that follows. I don't know how much time has passed. 3 days, maybe. I haven't slept. I barely breathe, and all I can think is, will it come for me next? Am I going to be the next one? I'm still here, writing this, but I feel my time running out. If anyone finds this message, stay away from this school. Never, ever go into the forest. On the last day of school, everything seemed normal, at least at first. I worked as a janitor at an elementary school back then, a position I had taken about a year earlier. My father, who had been a janitor at the same school, used to tell me stories about how the place was haunted. He always spoke casually, describing the supposed ghost's mischief as if he were talking about a curious neighbor. I thought he was just trying to liven things up with exaggerated stories. I never really believed in ghosts until that day. It was around 10:45 p.m. The last day of school had been chaotic, and the students and teachers had left the school in a celebratory mood. After cleaning all the classrooms, my only remaining task was to turn off the lights and lock up the building. When I got to the light switches in the main hallway, near the library, I heard something that froze my whole body, a child's giggle. The laugh was faint, almost like a whisper, but it was there. It came from a library, that space that always had something peculiar about it, maybe because of the way the shelves and shadows created a mysterious atmosphere. The sound didn't seem threatening, but still, I felt a chill run up my spine. Instinctively, I looked around, but everything was empty. The dark hallway, the classroom doors closed. It didn't make sense. I decided to rush straight to the boiler room, where my colleague was. I entered quickly and explained what I had just heard. He looked at me, visibly uncomfortable, but I insisted that he come with me to finish turning off the lights. He hesitated at first, saying he didn't want to get involved in ghost problems, but in the end he agreed. We went back to the switches together. We turned off the lights near the library as quickly as possible, avoiding looking too much into the room. Then, we turned off the lights in the kitchen and at the main entrance. Fortunately, nothing else happened while we were together. My colleague seemed relieved, but I knew that this school would be my permanent assignment for much longer, and the thought of having to deal with that something alone made me uneasy. When I got home that night, I told my dad what had happened. He smiled, finding humor in the situation, and told me something intriguing. He believed the ghost had gone away. According to him, many years ago, he felt a constant presence in the building, but at some point, that feeling disappeared. He believed that by acknowledging and respecting the spirit, the boy had found peace. But it seems he was wrong. The following days confirmed that the ghost boy was back. Whiteboard erasers that disappeared and reappeared in unlikely places. Doors that closed on their own. And occasionally, the sound of light footsteps in the hallway when I knew I was alone. Over time, I learned the story of the boy. He was a student at the school, an autistic child who loved the library. One day, he suffered a severe accident and passed away on his way to the hospital. His former teacher and the principal at the time confirmed that the library was his favorite place, and many of the strange occurrences were centered there. Although scary, the boy didn't seem to be malicious. Gradually, I began to understand that he simply wanted company, maybe even a little attention. And just like my father, I started to work with respect for that little presence that roamed the school hallways, especially at the end of the year, when the silence and solitude made it seem like he was just waiting for the next adventure. This story happened many years ago, so some details might be a bit blurry in my memory, but I'll try to tell it as best as I can. It was the last day of school, and I was in 4th grade. For our school, 4th grade was the last year where kids needed to be picked up by their parents. From 5th grade on, we were allowed to go home alone. My mom had always been the one to pick me up, and that day was no different. My friend Dennis and I had made plans to meet after school to celebrate the end of the school year. Even though we weren't in the same class that year, we'd been friends since kindergarten and always managed to find a way to hang out. When the school bell rang, as usual, we lined up to leave the school. I waited at the usual spot, near the main doors, where the kids stayed until their guardians arrived. I was looking at the crowd of parents and cars in the parking lot when I heard someone calling my name, Tommy, Tommy. I looked to the side and saw a man waving at me. He introduced himself as Dennis's uncle and said he was there to pick me up. I thought it was a little strange, but I trusted him. I told my teacher that I was being picked up, and after looking at the man for a moment, she let me go. He seemed a bit agitated, speaking quickly and walking fast, almost running. I had trouble keeping up with him with my backpack. As we walked to the car, he explained that Dennis's dad had gotten stuck at work and that he, as the uncle, was taking care of everything that day. When we reached the car, a red hatchback, something started to bother me. Why were we picking up Dennis too? I asked about it, and the man replied that Dennis was already at his house, waiting for us. That answer didn't convince me, but being a shy kid, I didn't question it further. The drive seemed longer than it should have. My house was very close to the school, but the direction he was taking wasn't familiar. The man tried to make small talk during the drive, asking about my favorite sports and what I liked to do at school. Still, something felt wrong. Finally, he parked in front of a house I had never seen before. It was an ordinary house, nothing that stood out. We went inside, and he locked the door behind us. The place was dark, with all the curtains shut, and the only light came from a dim lamp in the corner of the room. I asked about Dennis again, and the man said he was in the basement playing video games. He told me to wait a moment and went into another room. I heard a door open and footsteps going down the stairs. It was at that moment that my heart started to race. Something was very wrong. I decided to act. I ran to the front door, but it was locked and seemed to require a key. Desperate, I went to the kitchen and found a landline phone hanging on the wall. I picked up the receiver and dialed 911. I whispered, "Please help me. I'm in a strange house, and I've been kidnapped." I didn't wait for a response. I just hung up the phone and went back to where I was before. A little later, I heard the man's footsteps coming up the stairs. He called for me, saying Dennis was waiting in the basement. When I didn't respond, he came looking for me. He asked if I was okay, and with a trembling voice, I asked to leave. That's when his face changed. The smile disappeared, and he grabbed my wrist. He started pulling me toward the basement. I cried and screamed, but he shouted back, telling me to be quiet. I was taken down to the basement, and he locked the door behind me. The basement was cold, with a concrete floor and a light bulb hanging from the ceiling. I stood there, not knowing what to do. I heard his footsteps above me, pacing back and forth. After a while, he opened the door and asked if I was hungry. I said no, hoping he wouldn't notice the phone off the hook in the kitchen. He left me alone again. It was then that I heard the doorbell ring. 3 knocks, followed by loud banging on the door. My heart raced again. I knew it could be the police, but I waited in silence, trying to listen. A few minutes later, I heard a loud crash and heavy footsteps entering the house. I started shouting for help and ran to the basement door, banging on it. It was soon opened by a police officer who pulled me out of there. Outside, there were several police cars. I was finally safe. Later, I found out that the man wasn't Dennis's relative. He was just a co-worker of Dennis's dad who somehow knew we'd be picked up that day. He used that information to deceive the school and me. I never saw him again after that, but the incident left deep scars. I spent months in therapy, and to this day, I try not to think too much about that day. I know that if I hadn't called the police at that moment, my story could have ended very differently.